Welcome to Shop Talk Live, episode number 287. We've got a different episode for you today. We're not going to answer any woodworking questions. Instead, we are going to talk to Scott Landis of Greenwood Global and luthier Michael Bashkin. Both Scott and Michael are experts in forestry, conservation, and the many things to consider when using tropical hardwoods. So if you're ready for a deep dive into a subject that doesn't affect all woodworkers, but is incredibly interesting and important for all woodworkers to know, and important for everyone to think about, really, hang on. If that's not your deal, if you're looking for questions on mortise and tenons and finishing, you might want to skip this episode. All right, let's get to it. This is an episode that I have been wanting to do for quite a while, and I think that there's some myths to be dispelled. I think there's a lot of education to be had. And when I think about the two people here, we're covering a gamut of perspectives. And so, Scott Landis, your history goes way back with the magazine and with Taunton Books. And was it maybe 3 years ago that we did... It was 3 or 4 years ago that we did a podcast episode, right?
Yeah, I think it was 4 years ago in 2019.
Okay. And we talked about Greenwood Global a bit and your efforts. And at the time you were doing turning mallets
Right.
in Honduras, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And
yep.
So
I brought one for show here.
Those things sold out quickly. I mean, that was a great little initiative that people could really jump onto. I know a bunch of people who I've talked to have bought those mallets.
Cool.
So can you give us a little bit of your backstory?
Well, maybe how I got into the whole forestry tropical connection to woodworking maybe is a good place to start.
Did you start off as a woodworker, or did you start off in conservation?
No, I started off as a woodworker in a whole variety of different woodworking enterprises, from building log buildings to building snowshoes and canoes. I spent a lot of time paddling a canoe about halfway across Canada, and so it was kind of a northern adventure. And I came to Taunton Press in around 1984 as an editor in the book department, and worked on some wonderful books there, and eventually got the idea to do a book about workbenches, which became the Workbench book. And that actually grew out of a little enterprise that I developed with Michael Fortune. At the time, we were both living in Toronto, and we worked on developing a workbench for sale. And I think we sold about 5 workbenches, and then discovered that most of the woodworkers we ran into wanted to build their own. Mm-hmm. And that inspired the whole idea for doing a whole book about workbenches, and eventually the Workbench book, and then the workshop book. And that was after that, I just continued writing about a whole variety of different woodworking related activities, and a good bit of that for Taunton Press, Fine Woodworking. And it was actually an article that I did for Fine Woodworking back in late 80s about a project in the Peruvian Amazon that made this whole connection and leap for me from woodworking to the forestry side. And that was, I went down to trace the harvest of and export of a whole bunch of lesser known, virtually unknown tropical wood species from this valley in Peru. to California. It was being organized by what was then the Luthiers Mercantile and the Sonoma County Woodworkers Association. And this was in conjunction with a pretty well-known forestry project that was sponsored by the U.S. government in the Amazon, and it was called the Strip Shelter Belt System of Forest Management. And to cut to the chase on that, strip shelter belt meant clear cutting narrow strips of rainforest to see what the optimum widths of these strips would be for natural regeneration to take place without having to plant trees. Well, when you clear cut a strip of rainforest, what you're left with is a wide variety of unknown tropical woods that have no market. And the whole idea of this export process to California was to find out what properties these woods had, what applications they might have, and then eventually to build markets for those woods. And it's all about creating incentives at the local level for, as we like to put it, making the forest too valuable to burn. And so that then led to a conference, which led to the founding of the Woodworkers Alliance for Rainforest Protection of WARP, which a whole bunch of other folks that would be familiar to fine woodworking readers got involved with. Curtis Buchanan, Brian Boggs, Silas Kopp were all key players in that whole enterprise. And that then led to, actually it was Curtis Buchanan and Brian Boggs who I went down with to Honduras in 1993, and they started teaching folks in Honduras how to make the chairs from green wood using hand tool technology, because most of these forest communities, all the forest communities where we worked, were remote. They had no electricity. And so we were looking for what we called appropriate technology, and green woodworking had really had a lot to bring to those communities. Eventually that then morphed and became Greenwood, and it has continued since then. So, and
it's, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like it's become your life's calling, your life's work these days.
Well, for at least the last 30 years. So I'd like to think there's still a little left in life. But yes, it's become a major passion for me. And unfortunately, I don't get to do as much woodworking as I once did or would like to do. But who knows what the future might bring there.
So Michael, I find it interesting because you almost had a reverse trajectory. You started off in forestry, right? And now for those who don't know, Michael Bashkin is, my luthier buddy who I bug with text messages with questions all the time. And you, I'm going to talk about you like you're not here. You build, for all intents and purposes, just about the highest end guitars the world knows, some of the finest work that I've seen in any wood format. And you also host a podcast, Luthier on Luthier, that I help you mix from time to time. And, but so tell us a little bit about your background in forestry and journey with wood.
Sure. You got it. Well, thanks for the introduction, Ben, and yes, I would have been more comfortable not being here, hearing you say that. But thank you. And I'd also just like to mention that the very first woodworking book that I got was Scott's workshop book. So that's
the very first
woodworking book. I had other books before that, for sure. But so it's a pleasure to be on the podcast with both of you today. And so, yes, I came into woodworking through really through forestry. So I in college I studied forestry with an emphasis in soils and management, and then for a couple years I worked various jobs with mostly at doing academic research, Duke University. And then I pursued a master's degree in forestry with an emphasis on tropical soils and their management. And did some teaching down in Belize. And I also did a fair amount of my graduate research work over in Hawaii, which was really tough, let me tell you. But so I at a certain level, I was doing very kind of basic level research about carbon cycling in soils after reforestation from sugarcane plantations, pardon me, and using methodology, using carbon isotopes to trace how different pools of carbon were turning over in the soil. And then
So
when
basic stuff.
well, yeah, it's not light reading. Well,
Yeah.
it's reading. If you want to go to sleep, then it's probably great
Yeah.
stuff. And then I was fortunate enough to get hired to teach in Belize. It was basically a study abroad type program for mostly American undergraduate students. And I was teaching tropical forest management in southern Belize, very, very close to Punta Gorda. And it was about this time that I became interested in guitar building. And so a lot of the woods that I was interested in working with, I could actually look at in their, at their source. I could look at, mahogany and Spanish cedar and ziricote and Honduran rosewood, right on the stump, so to speak. And so I became interested not only in tropical hardwoods from kind of an academic and management perspective, but then as an end user of those woods. And over the years, I've have a sort of an uneasy relationship with using these woods. They're beautiful. I love to use traditional tone woods, and I would like to think that ultimately it's not such a dire situation that we can't use these woods, but what we do have to do is support their legal and good management of this resource.
So it's become painfully clear, and that this is a very nuanced subject, right? There's so many elements and so many perspectives in tropical hardwoods and forestry management, and whether we as end users play. I think, Michael, I think you, in your 2017 article in the Guild of American Luthiers, you had said something that, luthiers play a very, very minor role in the use of these woods, but you have an outsized voice, if you will, where it's a lot of what we do as woodworkers and what you do as luthiers is the focus of a lot of these discussions with tropical woods, exotic woods. But there's a lot that goes into it. And I thought that it might be cool to just keep the conversation focused for now on mahogany. So, So can we discuss, I know both of you have very, very intense relationships with mahogany forestry, right? Scott, you in Honduras, your Greenwood Global, you support efforts to forest in a responsible manner, and then you actually connect the foresters to sales to retailers here in America, right? What does that relationship look like? Well,
we started in Honduras with mahogany. Our initial, as I mentioned before, our initial activities in Honduras were the chair making workshops that Curtis and Brian developed, which was definitely not using any mahogany. It was all based on lesser known wood species, and it was in a community that didn't have any mahogany as well, second growth forest. I had encountered a fellow who was helping to develop I think the first FSC, Forest Stewardship Council certified forest in the world, from a community forest in Honduras in around 2000, the year 2000. And in talking with him, he was saying the problem is that forest stewardship, the whole process of FSC certification, the forest management component, it all takes resources. It costs money, and one of the big problems that's developed in a lot of these tropical environments is that they don't have markets or anybody willing to compensate them for that extra, that extra cost. And so we started talking about, well, what are the assets that they have in these community forests? And mahogany was the primary one that was an identified species that we knew had a high value market. And we said, okay, well, what's the highest value we can get from this mahogany? And obviously it was guitar wood. It was, the top of the food chain. So we reached out to a number of different guitar companies, and the one that really responded most enthusiastically was Bob Taylor and Taylor Guitars. And it went through Michael and I had a conversation about this the other day, and went through a kind of an extended process. It took us about 3 years to get sawmills installed on the ground, to send samples, and then to ship the first container of mahogany guitar wood to Taylor Guitars. That was, roughly 2005, I'm guessing, and that was from a single community in Honduras, and that then expanded to incorporate 3 different agroforestry cooperatives in 3 different communities that were all part of this process. And that has continued for roughly 15 plus years, 15, 16 years, something like that. And on the level of exporting roughly 2 containers of mahogany per year. So, 30 to 35 containers, not an enormous industrial production, very small percentage of Taylor's actual use of mahogany in production as well. Beyond Taylor, we've also sold to Allied Luther's Mercantile, several other guitar makers, to Collings in Texas as well, and smaller makers. And then some of the offcuts went to furniture, export for furniture use. But the impacts on these communities were mahogany in those forests grows at a density of roughly one or two trees per hectare in those forests.
Can you define a hectare?
Hectare is what it's 2 point. Michael, help me if you can. It's
You're on your
2
own.
points.
Sorry.
Okay, it's something like 2.18 acres per hectare, something like that.
So one to two trees. For...
1 to 2 trees for over a couple of acres, and their annual harvest from each. And these communities would have an area of roughly 4,000 to 5,000 hectares. So we're talking about 8,000 to 10,000 acres, and a little bit more than that. And their annual harvest from each of these communities would be something like 6 to 8 trees per year. So we're talking about a very small impact in terms of the harvest as a percentage of the inventory.
So this is These numbers are from around what time? Is this the FSC certified forestry?
Well, these communities were, all of them had been FSC certified at the very beginning when we started, and all of them then ceased to become officially FSC certified. Basically, and this whole thing is a pretty interesting process. I remember trying to, when I first introduced this to Bob Taylor and Taylor Guitars, I was also introducing the concept of supporting FSC certification. Mm-hmm. And Bob's response was basically, FSC needs us more than we need FSC to, in terms of marketing and selling our product. People buy Taylor guitars because of the quality of the instrument. And what they did was Taylor sent their wood folks down on multiple occasions. They camped out in the forest with our foresters on the ground to oversee the harvest. And it became what I like to call first person certification, built on relationships. Certification by definition is outsourcing that responsibility to a third party. Mm-hmm. And I guess I don't want to say I'm cynical, but I've seen enough of outsourcing to third parties to have, a qualified approach to that process. I like to know who I'm dealing with. I like to know the people on the ground. I like to either see it myself or have somebody I trust see it and see what's going on. And that's basically the approach that Taylor took and has taken, as far as I can tell, in their other enterprises as well. So none of those groups are certified today. Okay. And in fact, what's also happened, and there are really kind of multiple, this is a complex subject here, but as you suggested at the beginning, but I think there are really kind of three main keys here in the tropics, at least, to sustainability. And, one is ownership. Who owns these forests, and establishing the rights to ownership is a key piece. Second piece is governance. That who's enforcing the laws, and who's implementing management plans and overseeing all of that. And the third is incentives, is what I mentioned before, making the forest too valuable to burn. So creating incentives for the people who live there to preserve and protect that forest. And what has unfortunately happened in all three of those communities that we've been working in for 15 plus years is that there have been serious invasions of outside folks coming into those forests, clear cutting parts of it, and for cattle and other agricultural purposes. And this is unfortunately a really common practice all over the world. So it's, all three of those groups, there's still considerable amount of forest remaining in those communities, but none of them are actively harvesting now. They've, to some extent, they've kind of gone over to the dark side, that they're more involved in the conversion of those forests to agriculture and to other illegal pursuits, frankly, to illegal gold mining, to narco trafficking. It's not so much that they're illegally cutting and selling wood, although some of that is probably going on too. But it's a complex interaction of a whole lot of other economic and political factors. And there's no governance, zero. Which is
a key element, 1/3 of your game plan. Michael, what was your experience like down when you were living and working in these forests. So that was in the 90s, was it?
Yeah, I was in the late 90s. And so somewhat similar to Scott's experience, I saw some really good projects happening. And at the same time, and geographically in the same space, I saw some things that were not so good. The area that I was in was a large conservation area, and they had a sustainable management plan that everything looked great on paper, and a large multinational timber company had come in. They built a mill. They got the concession to do the logging in this area. But the mill was huge. It was much bigger than the area that was in the management plan. And just anecdotally, what I was hearing was that not only were they getting wood from inside the management area, but basically from everywhere else as well. And so one of the potential issues was that it was kind of used as a greenwashing to, not only was there good management happening, but illegal logging, maybe some questionable management practices were also happening at the same time to feed this mill. And I just want to reiterate a couple things that Scott said, in that I think, the important part here, and he's slightly different terminology, but coming from the forestry world, we like to use the terms people, profit, and planet. And it's essentially covers the same thing, but I really do think that the key is that you do have to make the forest viable enough that it's worthy of protection, because in terms of what's driving deforestation at a global level, as Scott said, it's a very complex issue. And it's not just the demand for these woods, for the timber. It often starts with a logging road. And then once the road is in, then all of a sudden the area is opened up to other uses like conversion to, say, citrus or palm oil plantations, cattle grazing, et cetera. So, there are models out there. Agroforestry is a popular model where you're kind of combining the timber management with agricultural products. And there are examples and success stories like that around the world. But at the same time, I think there's an equal or greater number of areas where it hasn't worked out or it's not working out. And, ultimately the driving force just has to do with the society's demand for the land and what's going to happen. And if their demand is for forest products, then, these would be well-managed forests. If there's a higher demand for, cattle and other agricultural products, then, in many cases, that's where the land goes. It's not always a one-way street. I do think that, there are opportunities for land conversion once you deforest an area. That doesn't mean that it's gone forever. It may be harder to reforest, or, there's certainly challenges to do it. But I think, in most cases, the technical know-how is there in terms of reforesting areas. But again, the both the socio-political and economic forces have to be there to drive those changes.
Yeah, and if I can jump in on that too, you're absolutely right, Michael. And that whole the real challenge for reforestation is, as we all know, it takes a long time to grow a tree, and to grow a tree to its harvestable size. And so, if you're asking people to plant trees for their grandkids, it's a tough sell in communities where you need to put food on the table tonight. And so that agroforestry is something that our colleagues, Greenwood had established a counterpart organization called Fundación Madera Verde, which is just Greenwood Foundation in Spanish, in Honduras, which conducts all of the forestry activities that we do on the ground. And they're our partner organization. And they've gotten involved in those kinds of really kind of pilot agroforestry projects. But the potential of that is to provide some immediate or short-term generation of income to make it worth maintaining and growing that forest.
Without getting too much into the weeds, I mean, people are trying to feed their families in these communities, and they got to do it how they can do it. And it's obviously a difficult thing to go down there and ask them, please stop doing what you're doing when you're literally just trying to feed your family. So it really comes back to making it too profitable to burn, to giving them a source of income to feed, to sell these timbers. So what do you see? What either of you? What do you see as the future for Honduran, South American mahogany? Is it a thing of the past in the sizes that we're needing as furniture makers and luthiers and builders? Is this something that we just need to forget about?
I think yes. I think the supply is already constricted. It's not what it was. I think it will continue to constrict. And I think both the sizes of wood available in lumber form and also the quality of the wood will continue to decline as the price rises. So that's what I can foresee for mahogany. Now there are other substitutes. For example, kaya or African mahogany has been very popular in the guitar community for necks, etc., as a substitute. And but now there's beginning to be some restrictions on that. I think the CITES listing on kaya just went up a notch. I'm not sure which appendix that it is. So to be honest with you, Ben, I don't really know that just isolating the discussion to mahogany is maybe as useful as looking at tropical timber as a whole. And I just make a couple comments on that, in that most of the wood that is harvested from tropical forests ends up going to a few countries, and I believe those top importers are China, India, Vietnam. Much of it is used for hungmo furniture, and these includes not just mahogany but rosewoods, etc. And much of it ends up in veneers, paneling, products that is then turned around and exported to a large degree. So we're all responsible for this. It's not just the countries that import it. It's that there's a demand for these products. And I don't think that the FSC certification is definitely a step in the right direction. There are some issues with it in terms of, again, greenwashing, where the illegal timber trade gets sort of intermixed and enters the markets through FSC. So I don't have any easy answers other than to say that, I think at the individual woodworker level, what you can do is certainly consider local sources, local woods. And if you do use exotics, then take an active role in their legal and proper management. And if that means, voting or supporting NGOs or conservation organizations. That's one way to do it. Another thing that I can suggest is to pay to have trees planted, and that's something that I do in my own business. If I build a guitar from a certain region, then I will, after that guitar is done, I'll then plant usually about 20 trees back in that same region. Now, several caveats with that. I'm not out there planting the trees to myself, and not all the trees survive. And there's definitely some issues with this dollar a tree planting. But even if one or two trees survive, then again, it's a step in the right direction.
I want to let everyone know about Taunton's newest e-learning class, Introduction to Surface Carving with the one and only Michael Cullen. The course begins on April 12th and features more than 6 hours of in-depth video lessons, an exclusive community forum, and live Q&A sessions with Michael, which is probably going to be the funnest part. I am truly enamored with Michael's carving, and even though I had nothing to do with this course, I'm probably going to take this course at night because I want to learn how to do what Michael does. Michael's surface carving is something that I think is approachable while still being able to elevate any piece of furniture or even an ukulele maybe. We'll see. Head on over to finewoodworking.com/elearning for more information, and maybe I'll see you there. You had hinted at something, and I know that this is a major part of what you focus on, Scott, is, especially with the work in Puerto Rico right now, is all of these downed timbers from the hurricane, and finding uses for these sometimes unknown species. Can you elaborate on that element of let's stop focusing on this one particular type of wood that we've seen Thomas Sheridan make things out of, so.
Yeah. And I also, I guess I would concur with a lot of what Michael was just explaining too, in terms of the quality of the wood, the access to a species like mahogany is going to decline. I think most of the trade that I'm hearing of now is coming from secondary forests and plantations. A lot of for example, a lot of Taylor wood, I believe, is coming from Fijian plantations of mahogany that are relatively young compared to the old growth trees that were coming out of the communities that we work with in Honduras. And I guess you're right, Ben, that I think it's really important to focus on making the best use out of the woods that are available, that are closer to home, if you will, which even goes beyond or obviously goes beyond just tropical, looking at tropical woods. It's kind of interesting to look at, and I'll get back to Puerto Rico in a second too, but one of the interesting things that Taylor Guitars has gotten involved with over the last couple of years is harvesting, using urban harvested trees from California in their instruments, including an urban ash, which is a primary wood in a whole new line of guitars that Taylor's been developing. And these are, harvested street trees in California. So there are other opportunities here. If we look more seriously and creatively at that, in Puerto Rico, it's been really interesting because Greenwood was invited to come into Puerto Rico by the U.S. Forest Service about 2 months after Hurricane Maria it hit the island, a Category 5 hurricane that deposited millions of cubic yards of down timber all over the island. And the initial plan of FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers and the establishment in Puerto Rico was to burn that wood. Not exactly what I'd call an enlightened use of timber. And part of that had to do with the fact that there was no developed market in Puerto Rico. There was no connection between the forests of Puerto Rico and the local economy. Puerto Rico, when the U.S. took possession just over 100 years ago, was basically deforested. It was entirely agriculture, estimated to be about 6% forested when the U.S. took possession. Today, it's estimated to be about 65% forested. So I live in New England, which is, a lot of folks here talk about how the forest has recovered. Well, we took us a couple centuries to recover from having been clear cut for timber and then to plant sheep, and but they compressed that in Puerto Rico in roughly 100 years. And a lot of that was due to active planting by U.S. Forest Service. And some of that was mahogany. There was a lot of both the Honduran or the macrophylla, Sweetina macrophylla mahogany, and the so-called Cuban or Dominican mahogany, which was the Mahogany. They were both planted in Puerto Rico, where it was not considered to be a native species. Surprise to me, because it's also grown. It is native right next door in Cuba and the Dominican Republic. And then those two species have hybridized and created a third species that is somewhere in between big leaf and small leaf mahogany. So there are large populations of mahogany on Puerto Rico, but they estimate to have something like 750 different tree species on the island. And I don't think most Puerto Ricans probably can't name more than two or three, maybe 5 or 6. If you include mango and other tree species and ornamentals. But as a result of this having been a fairly recent, as we said earlier, it takes a while to grow a tree to harvestable dimension. The trees are now just starting to reach a 60, 80 year age for some of the older ones, which would be beginning to be of a harvestable, what would be considered a harvestable dimension. Still much smaller than the old growth timber that we were familiar with in Honduras. But there are a whole lot of other species there that that could have been explored if there was any kind of productive capacity. The fact that there wasn't any production meant that when the hurricanes came, there was no local capacity to mill that, to dry it. There is no kiln on the island of Puerto Rico for artisanal wood production. The only kiln that we were able to find in Puerto Rico was to kiln dry pallet stock for the pharmaceutical industry and for shipping internationally, because it needs to be kiln dried to meet the international shipping regulations. So it's a complicated environment. And what you're seeing, what I find really fascinating too about the situation in Puerto Rico is it's kind of witnessing the very beginning of what I would call an artisanal wood industry and the potential for that. So a lot of these pieces, the elements of forest management, the protocols and how it's going to be implemented and and practiced, have to be better coordinated, and there just needs to be a greater understanding, greater public awareness about the value of that resource and the potential it could contribute to the island, where there's a rich woodworking tradition of carving, of lutherie, boat building, all of those.
I mean, so in Puerto Rico, we've got ownership, we've got governance. What's the incentive? Where does that come in? And is that why it's been able to rebound and reforest so quickly?
Well, so much of the reforestation was the active role that government played in planting.
Okay.
And this is a story I've told a number of times, but the Forest Service, as I said, had been planting almost since it arrived on the island. And so through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the Forest Service was actively planting. Some of that was mahogany. Some of it was they were planting southern pine, anticipating a demand for the housing market, not anticipating how actively pine production was going to grow on the mainland U.S. and completely outcompete them on the island. But sometime around the 1980s or 90s, the Forest Service proposed a thinning cut in these forests, in these mahogany forests that they'd been planting, and the population rose up. They tied themselves to trees. And they said, "You're clear cutting our patrimony." And the Forest Service never made the case. It was an intensely political issue. So they didn't harvest. And had they harvested at that point in the 80s and 90s, that might have provided the resource to encourage the establishment of sawmills, some kiln drying, these basic elements that comprise a functioning timber market, even at an artisanal scale. Having not done that, when the hurricanes came through, there was no local capacity. Nobody had been processing wood. Puerto Rico imports something like 95% of its wood products from the U.S. All the luthiers I know in Puerto Rico, despite the growth of mahogany on the island, some of it is now at a fairly at a reasonably good size. All of them import their wood from off island, and all the folks that I've run into there. So it's again making this providing access, and it's yes, there is governance on the island, but it's not as well coordinated. The U.S. Forest Service has, they have responsibility for certain, for the national forest, El Yunque, and a couple of other areas on the island. But there's a state, there are state forests. There are, even though Puerto Rico is not officially a state, but what they call state forests, and then there are municipal forests, and then there are private land holdings. And there just is not a very well-established protocol for forest management, for folks to manage that timber in a responsible way. And then there isn't the access to the production, to the primary production, sawmills and kilns. That's just developing right now, and we're kind of watching it happen and trying to encourage that to happen.
Michael, as somebody you harvest standing dead spruce for your guitars yourself, don't you?
I do. Mm-hmm.
As somebody who goes into the forest and plays an active role in harvesting stock for your builds, as with everything, there's nuance to it. There, not cutting down any trees is probably to the detriment of many of these forests, right?
Not necessarily. It depends. In the particular case where I go in Colorado, I'm exclusively harvesting beetle kill spruce. So there's some issues with the forest health, wildfire, etc. And one way or another, these trees died a while ago, and most of them have actually fallen over, so they're not standing dead.
Okay.
But in some areas, they're thick enough where they're not actually lying on the ground, but they're sort of propped up, because they've fallen on top of other logs. So essentially, the wood is
super dangerous.
No, I wouldn't say super dangerous. Yeah, it's a little like a jungle gym, but it's the point is that it's air drying, and it's any rot that's happening is extremely slow, at least in these high elevation climates. So, what I do on an individual level is really has no effect on the forest or the ecosystem. Whether I remove just a portion of a tree, say the bottom 8 feet that's already fallen over, in an area that has experienced a lot of beetle kill, etc. There are sort of larger forces at work that are changing these forests. The winters are not as severe as they used to be. Likely, they may not come back as spruce. They may, come back as aspen, or at least aspen at first. So, I don't think that that's my experience with it. I would say that I would advocate for certain areas of forests to be just completely left alone. That's essentially what we have going on in the wilderness areas. There's no harvesting. You're not even supposed to bring mechanized equipment. Anything, including a chainsaw, if you're doing some management in these areas, like building trails, etc., is most of the time it's prohibited. So, but I think this opens up to a larger discussion of, if some areas are, say, off limits to human management, and we can intensely manage, other smaller areas like plantations, and use some of the forest technology that we have in terms of, establishing the tree species that we want, managing their growth in terms of things like pruning, spacing, thinning. We can actually get good quality wood in a decades long time span. And I think ultimately where I hope this is going is that both on the individual level and the supplier level, that these companies will start getting involved in the forestry business, and that they will buy plots of lands or become partners in plantations, and actually manage these areas specifically for their trade, and leave other areas completely alone.
So yeah. So how do you build those relationships with dealers, Scott? Are there, is there, we bring up FSC certification a lot. Is that something that as woodworkers we need to be looking at? Is there a tag we're looking for? Is there a question we're asking?
I guess just to, about the FSC in particular, I agree with Mike. It's a step in the right direction. I also agree that it's got, in terms of its implementation in a lot of the places I've been in the tropics, I think it just isn't what it's, what you'd like to see in those places. So again, and it's kind of my own and Greenwood's experience. It's much more on it's a different scale. It's not the kind of scale that can supply Home Depot. Mm-hmm. That kind of first person certification that I mentioned. It's about building relationships. I think one of the things woodworkers can do if they're buying wood is to ask the people they're buying it from, their suppliers, what the story is. Where did this wood come from? What can you tell me about the way this is managed and harvested? And if your supplier can't answer those questions, I'd look elsewhere. If they're just buying it on the open market, It's coming from anywhere. But there's an example I wanted to introduce that takes us away from tropical woods, and it has to do with about 20 years ago. I did an essay about two fellows in Vermont on the shore of Lake Champlain, Bruce Beacon and Jeff Parsons, who operate out of a place called Shelburne Farms, just south of Burlington, Vermont. And what their story was really fascinating. And basically, they were using the woods that were available to them from those forests, and that was driving all of their wood selections. So they were using woods like elm, hickory, locust, hop hornbeam. Those were not popular furniture woods, and they felt it was their calling to turn these woods into beautiful products, beautiful furniture. And what they wanted to determine the woods they were using was, what a forester might call woods run. It was what the forests were generating, and they really wanted. I remember them saying something about they wanted foresters basically to determine what woods they were going to use for their furniture, not the market. And then it was their job to sell that to the market, to convert that into a quality product. And, here in North America, we're all surrounded by different forests. And I'm looking out my window at a hornbeam tree right there. But I don't have a piece of hornbeam furniture in my house. And it's, we also know in all parts of this country, we're surrounded by forests that are increasingly under, variety of different threats, whether it's from drought or wind and snow, and whole variety of different or flooding. A lot of different factors, but there's a lot within that we could be making much better use of if we approach different direction.
Well, I'm a firm believer in getting back to what you're saying when you're talking to your suppliers. I'm a firm believer in, like, every dollar you spend is a vote for how you want the world to be. Chances are pretty good that the supplier who knows the source and everything is not going to be the cheapest supplier. So it's probably likely that the average Joe woodworker like myself has to suck it up, and if you can, pay a little bit more for your lumber to buy it from a reputable source, or to buy it from somebody who you're confident is playing their role in a responsible forestry ecosystem, But I mean, Michael, you have to sell guitars, and fact of the matter is the market is probably dictating that you're using mahogany for your necks, right? And how do you deal with it?
That is correct. I do use mahogany, and right now I'm making a single piece mahogany neck. So I'm dealing with a neck blank that's usually about, say, 3.5 by 3.5 by, at least 26 to say, 30 inches. And it's got to be quarter sawn. It has to be defect free. And that's a big ask these days. So a couple years ago, I basically went on a mahogany buying spree, but I was buying old stock. So I was buying from, other woodworkers, retiring luthiers, etc. I was not really buying, new mahogany that was coming onto the market. So that was my solution for my business. I don't think it's a solution in terms of the management of mahogany. So, I will admit that, the woods that I use in my guitars are essentially market driven, and the demand is for ebony fingerboards and often rosewood back and sides. And one thing that we were touching on earlier, which is in terms of, or you had mentioned earlier, is just how much wood goes into a guitar. The entire guitar industry, and this isn't just individual builders like myself, but this includes Taylor and Martin and Fender, etc., uses less than 0.1% of the global harvest of tropical hardwoods. And so we're not big users, but that doesn't mean we're absolved of responsibility. And I think, as you mentioned, Ben, earlier, we make a highly visible product, and that actually gives us an opportunity to see if we can create a market where we do have these woods responsibly managed, and also introduced alternative tone woods, as Scott was talking about. There's the area that I was working in Belize, there was something like 110 tree species per hectare, only two or three of which were commercially viable. Often those were harvested and the rest of the trees were just left on the ground. So I think there's opportunities to improve in all areas. And just to give an example from the tropics, in the Lutherie community, there's a cooperative called the International Pernambuco Cooperative, where violin bow makers in the U.S. actually put a moratorium on buying new stock, and with the caveat that there's plenty of existing stock in the U.S. to supply their needs, but so they weren't putting themselves out of business, but at the same time they invested money. They put dollars on the ground. They worked with NGOs, with governmental organizations in Brazil, and actually got planted over 250,000 Pernambuco trees in an agroforestry type setting. So they were often shade trees and coffee plantations, etc. And with some pruning and some management, it's estimated that they'll actually get usable wood for bows in about 30 years. So it could serve as a model, for not just the Lutherie community, but maybe the furniture community or the broader woodworking community as a whole.
Scott, it's a shame that there's not a organization out there that we could focus our efforts into as woodworkers and support. Don't you think there's somebody out there? What can we be doing? Tell us about what you're doing and how we can help.
Well, I will address that in a second. I wanted to I was reminded when Michael was talking about the use of the conventional tone woods for guitars, and the mahogany and the ebony, and the rosewoods. There's a fascinating example that again Taylor has played with the introduction of different grades or qualities of ebony for their boards. When Taylor took over a sawmill, an ebony sawmill in Cameroon, because there was no access to legal ebony in the marketplace, and they were, that was what they were after. And so they obtained that. And it's not a perfect system, the whole, lack of inventories and the whole supply chain is still being developed. But one of the first things that they discovered was the vast quantity of ebony that never made it into that guitar market, because it wasn't perfectly black. It wasn't uniformly dark. And Taylor kind of decided, well, that may be where we really make the biggest impact here, is that if we can introduce the use of ebony that has white in it, that is much more variegated than the conventional ebony fingerboard, that will that will open up opportunities, more compensation for the suppliers of ebony, so much less waste involved, just a much more efficient, productive use of the trees that are being harvested. So I think that's just an example of the kind of role that luthiers or all woodworkers can play. And it's, we kept touching on these points about, the woodworkers really having such a small, being responsible for such a small volume of overall wood consumption, and which was part of the mission for an exhibition that we organized actually before Greenwood, called Conservation by Design. That was an exhibition that we launched before Greenwood existed in 1993, with in conjunction with Rhode Island School of Design, and it launched at that museum, at their museum at RISD. It included work from 75 artisans from across U.S., Canada, and I think 3 other countries. Traveled across the country for a couple of years, and it closed at the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian. And that was the basic premise, is that we're not using a large volume of the world's wood, but we have an outsized presence in telling the story of the importance of these forests and our relationship to it and our responsibility as woodworkers and as citizens of the planet. So to answer your question, I would like to say, Ben, well, woodworkers can just, support Greenwood, but that's not going to do, that's not going to save the world or save the forest. We work at a very small scale, but, focused on the, trying to tell this story really. Yeah. And one of the ways that we're trying to tell this story in Puerto Rico, for example, that grew out of that whole experience of coming onto the island after the hurricane and seeing just the enormous volume of waste. That most of that wood that was going to be burned eventually got either chipped or is now becoming compost. And Greenwood launched last year, we launched a program called Artisan Eco Tours in Puerto Rico, where we combined a woodworking experience, a 6-day workshop with 3 days of immersion in the tropical forests of Puerto Rico, with guided experience in 3 different forest areas, really intensive introduction to what's going on in those forests, what it takes to regenerate a tropical forest after Category 5 hurricanes, and in the expectation that there's going to be another one around the corner. And what we did last year, and this, we actually had planned to launch it in 2020, in May of 2020. Yeah, I don't remember. There was something happened in 2020 and kind of disrupted the whole world, including us. So we postponed it for 2 years, and we launched it last May. And the 2 woodworking instructors were Michael Fortune, who will be, pretty familiar to the fine woodworking audience, and Renee Delgado, who's Puerto Rican furniture maker and an artist. And Renee actually came out of RIT in Rochester and was an apprentice to Wendell Castle. And so he has a deep background as well. But they ran the woodworking component, and then Greenwood put together a series of these eco-tour experiences on the island. And the idea was to try to strengthen these connections. You have these 2 very valuable resources: that forest that's growing and becoming an important part of the island landscape, and you have a long history of artisan woodworking on the island, and they are completely disconnected. So what we were trying to do is demonstrate how they could be connected, how so many of these woods could be utilized, and for the greater benefit of both the forests and the local economy. And we're running another one of these workshops again, Michael and Renee, this coming May, and we would welcome people from off the island as well as people from Puerto Rico. We combined them both last year as well.
That sounds like I've watched the video on YouTube. It looks like an incredible experience. And when we talk about, getting yourself out there and immersing yourself in the entire ecosystem of, the forest ecosystem and the ecosystem of tree to piece of furniture and the teaching and all of the elements, it's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, I mean, people, when they go to Puerto Rico, a typical place they'll go to if they go into the forest at all is the El Yunque National Forest, and the only tropical forest in the U.S. system. And they go into that forest, and their immediate impression is that this is a wilderness. Well, they'd be surprised to know that it was actually the source of the Pope's coffee. Before the U.S. took possession. It was a coffee plantation that was then planted by the U.S. Forest Service. And then all that was involved in that, and watching, how now it's a mix of native species, introduced species. It's a complicated environment. Yeah. But it's up to us to figure out how to do a much better job at managing these these forests. And
this conversation has been, in some ways utterly depressing, entirely educating, but there's definitely, like, I didn't know that forests can rebound with that, given the elements, people, profit, planet, given ownership, governance, and incentives. I didn't know that these elements these pieces could come together and help something rebound that quickly. So it's been a hopeful conversation for me as well. Michael, I know you've always had these conservation elements in mind and in your work and everything. And I thank you for coming on and sharing your experience. And
sure. Ben, could I just interrupt you? I'd like to bring the conversation back down to a more depressing level, which is to say, when you asked me earlier about my use of these woods, and I felt like, in retrospect, I didn't give a complete answer, and everything that I said previously, it stands. But I would also add to that I don't use these woods guilt-free. No matter how old they are, or where they came from, I know that there's still a cost associated with them. So that's my admission. I think that with that, there comes a responsibility, and there comes an awareness of where this material that we all love and cherish and hope is around for future generations to work with, to really appreciate it and be grateful for it. So,
but as someone who as someone who listens to all of your podcasts while mixing them, I do know that you are aware and cognizant of the need for all of us to play a role in finding new materials, finding more environmentally and sustainable materials, and how each and every one of us does that is probably going to be different. There's no one blueprint out there for any of our use cases. But
it would be interesting. I don't know what the numbers would yield, but if you could do an analysis where, say, as a woodworker, what would yield the greatest benefit? Would it say to be not using tropical hardwoods, or to say don't get on that plane and take a local vacation,
Yeah.
a staycation, as they say? I don't know what those numbers would look like, but it does have to fit into a larger picture where you can do the greatest good with what you have.
Or is it buying tropical hardwoods from a place that is fully responsibly harvested and feeding families in other parts of the world?
Mm-hmm.
Scott?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the game that we've been playing here is, and again, going back to trying to create those incentives, trying to add as much value as possible, as close to the forest as possible.
Yeah.
And it's a tough, it's a tough game to play. And there are no guarantees in it. And, as I explained, we can work for 15 to 20 years in a group of communities, and then it stops working for reasons that are completely outside of our control. But I think fundamentally, and I don't want to put a quasi-religious aspect on this, but a lot of folks grew up thinking that the plants and animals of the earth were just put here for our consumption, and for our benefit. And I think we need to feel like we're all part of the same partnership, if you will, and we need to just focus more on that partnership, and that it's our responsibility as well as to our benefit to contribute as much as we can to that the sustainability of that's the systems on which we depend.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for this discussion, and we will have links to Greenwood Global, and if you can share some videos with me, Scott, I'll put those in the show notes about the Eco Artisan Tours and all of that links. And Michael, I'm probably going to steal one of your guitar photos for the thumbnail. So
sure. You got it.
But thank you both for helping us to understand a very, very complicated subject. Well, that does it for this episode of Shop Talk Live. Head on over to greenwoodglobal.org to find out more about the work that Greenwood Global is doing, and to find out more about the Eco Artisan Tour in Puerto Rico. If you want to gawk at Michael Bashkin's guitars, head on over to Bashkin, Bashkin, guitars.com. You'll see what I'm talking about. His work is incredible. As always, you can find out more information on our show notes at shoptalklive.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Thanks for listening.